The birthday cake sat untouched on the marble counter, 30 candles melting into wax, while the billionaire handed his pregnant wife divorce papers with the same casual indifference he'd used to dismiss a maid. She'd spent the morning feeling their child kick for the first time, yet now she stood in the home she'd secretly purchased with her own hidden fortune, watching the man she'd loved discard her like yesterday's news. Though he had no idea the struggling artist he'd married was actually a secret trillionaire who'd anonymously invested $12 million to save his failing business 18 months ago. The mistress appeared from the bedroom wearing his late mother's robe, a calculated insult, her laugh echoing through halls that the pregnant wife had decorated with her own money, though every renovation receipt sat hidden in a safety deposit box alongside her real identity. He pulled out a cream-colored envelope then, embossed with gold lettering, and the pregnant wife's hands shook as she read the invitation to his wedding with his mistress, scheduled for 6 weeks away, yet her tears weren't from heartbreak but from fury at her own blindness to his character. His sister burst through the front door moments later, her presence always a hurricane of judgment and cruelty, screaming about how the gold digger finally got what she deserved, completely unaware that the pregnant woman before her had a net worth that made their family's billionaire status look like pocket change. The divorce was finalized within 3 weeks, but the pregnant wife spent that time carefully planning, gathering evidence, and arranging an arrival that would expose every lie they'd built their happiness upon. She remembered the night she'd transferred funds to save his company, remembered his assistant thanking the anonymous donor while she stood right beside him, pregnant and invisible, her secret trillionaire identity protected by offshore accounts and legal structures he'd never thought to investigate. The wedding invitation sat framed on her new penthouse desk, a reminder that some battles require patience, and as she prepared for the ceremony, she arranged for her midnight blue Rolls-Royce to arrive exactly 15 minutes after the vows, timed for maximum impact. The wedding day sparkled with expensive flowers and false smiles, but everything shifted when the Rolls-Royce glided up the circular driveway, and the billionaire's face went pale as his ex-wife, his pregnant ex-wife who he'd dismissed as worthless, stepped out wearing a fortune on her body and carrying documents that would destroy everything. His sister approached with characteristic venom, and when she spat on the pregnant woman's face in front of everyone they knew, what happened next crushed them so completely that their social standing, business reputation, and carefully constructed lies disintegrated before the champagne even went flat. This story reveals how silent strength triumphs over arrogance, how underestimating others based on appearance leads to devastating consequences, and how true power lies not in flaunting wealth but in strategic patience and dignity under fire. Viewers will learn the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of their perceived status, the danger of betraying loyal partners, the value of financial independence, and how karma works not through revenge, but through the natural revelation of truth and character. This story teaches that true power isn't about flaunting wealth or seeking revenge, but about maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty and allowing truth to speak for itself. It demonstrates how people reveal their character through how they treat those they believe are powerless, and how patience combined with strategic revelation creates consequences far more effective than immediate retaliation. Viewers learn the critical importance of financial independence, the danger of underestimating others based on appearance or perceived status, and the reality that betrayal always carries consequences, not through forced revenge, but through the natural unraveling of lies when confronted with documented truth. The morning had started with hope, something that felt almost foreign to Victoria Hayes, after 3 years of marriage to a man who'd stopped seeing her months ago. She'd woken at dawn, her hand instinctively moving to the swell of her belly, where their daughter had been kicking with increasing frequency, and for a brief moment she'd allowed herself to imagine that today, her 30th birthday, might be different. The pregnancy had been unplanned, yet desperately wanted, at least by her, though Nathan's reaction to the news had been a tight smile that never reached his eyes and a comment about timing that felt like acid on an open wound. She'd decorated the penthouse herself 4 months ago, spending 3 days arranging flowers and selecting the perfect shade of cream for the walls. Yet Nathan had walked through the completed renovation without comment, his phone pressed to his ear as he discussed quarterly earnings with someone who apparently mattered more than the woman carrying his child. What he didn't know, what he'd never thought to investigate, was that Victoria had purchased this penthouse 2 years ago through a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, that the $8 million price tag had been paid in cash from accounts he'd never seen, and that every piece of furniture he believed he'd bought with his billionaire success had actually come from her secret trillionaire fortune. The birthday cake had arrived at 8 in the morning, delivered by the bakery she'd mentioned loving 3 months ago, in a conversation Nathan had apparently been present for, yet clearly hadn't heard. She'd placed it on the marble counter herself, lighting 30 candles with hands that trembled slightly, because hope and fear often wear the same face, and she'd waited for him to emerge from his study, where he'd spent the night supposedly working on a presentation. The candles had burned for 17 minutes before Nathan finally appeared, his tailored suit immaculate despite the early hour, his expression carrying something she couldn't quite identify, though later she'd recognize it as resolution mixed with relief. He'd placed the manila envelope beside the cake without ceremony, the legal papers inside already signed with his bold signature, and Victoria had stared at the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," while wax dripped onto the marble like tears she refused to shed. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, a phrase so bland it felt insulting, yet what struck her most was the date he'd filed, 3 weeks ago, meaning he'd been planning this for nearly a month, while she'd been researching nursery colors and interviewing potential nannies. Nathan had spoken then, his voice carrying the same tone he used in board meetings when delivering quarterly reports to investors who'd never quite believed in his vision. He'd explained that his mistress made him happy in ways Victoria never could, that their marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, and that the pregnancy was unfortunate timing but wouldn't change his decision, though he'd ensure the child was taken care of through appropriate financial channels. Victoria had listened with her hand still resting on her belly, feeling their daughter kick as if in protest. Yet she'd remained silent because shock has a way of stealing language when you need it most. What Nathan didn't know, what would have shattered his carefully constructed narrative, was that 18 months ago his company had been 3 weeks from bankruptcy, that creditors had been threatening lawsuits that would have destroyed everything he'd built, and that an anonymous investor had wired $12 million at precisely the moment his CFO was recommending Chapter 11 filing. That anonymous investor had been Victoria, watching from their bedroom as Nathan celebrated the miracle that had saved Hayes. Technology, never once considering that his pregnant wife might have resources beyond the modest trust fund he believed was her only asset. The mistress had appeared then, emerging from the master bedroom with deliberate timing that suggested she'd been waiting for her cue. Her name was Cassandra Vale, a marketing executive Nathan had hired 8 months ago, and she wore his late mother's silk robe like a trophy won in battle Victoria hadn't known she was fighting. Cassandra's laugh had echoed through the penthouse, a sound designed to establish dominance, yet Victoria had recognized the insecurity beneath it, because women who are truly secure don't need to perform their victories. Nathan had wrapped his arm around Cassandra's waist with casual possession, and Victoria had watched this display with clinical detachment, her mind already moving beyond heartbreak into the cold territory of strategy and calculation. The cream-colored envelope had come next, pulled from Nathan's briefcase with flourish that bordered on theatrical, and Victoria's hands had trembled as she read the wedding invitation, embossed with gold lettering that announced Nathan Hayes and Cassandra Vale's marriage ceremony, scheduled for 6 weeks from today at the Plaza, the same venue where she and Nathan had exchanged vows 3 years ago. The symbolism felt deliberately cruel, a calculated decision to maximize her humiliation, yet as tears blurred the expensive cardstock, Victoria realized they weren't tears of heartbreak but of fury, fury at herself for believing that love could exist without respect, fury at Nathan for his casual cruelty, and fury at the years she'd spent making herself smaller to accommodate a man who'd never valued her presence. The front door had crashed open with the force of someone who'd never learned that entrance could be made without announcement, and Victoria had known immediately that Nathan's sister had arrived to deliver the final blow. Rebecca Hayes Morrison had inherited their father's sense of superiority and their mother's talent for cruelty, blending both into a personality that left scorched earth wherever she walked. Yet Victoria had endured 3 years of her contempt, because marriage sometimes means accepting poisonous relatives as part of the package. Rebecca's Louboutin heels had clicked against the Italian tile with staccato rhythm, each step a proclamation of territory she believed belonged to her family alone. And her eyes had swept over Victoria with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. The words that followed had been predictable, yet still capable of drawing blood. Accusations of gold digging, celebrations of Victoria's removal from their family, promises that everyone in their social circle would know she'd been discarded for someone better. Yet what Rebecca hadn't known was that the woman she was verbally eviscerating owned a portfolio that included commercial real estate in 17 countries, tech company, shares that generated 7 figures monthly in dividends, and offshore accounts that had been carefully managed by a Swiss firm since before Victoria had ever met Nathan Hayes. Victoria had stood there absorbing Rebecca's venom, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly, yet beneath the apparent submission, her mind was cataloging every insult for future reference. Rebecca had turned to Nathan and Cassandra then, her smile transforming into something warm and genuine, the kind of affection she reserved exclusively for people she deemed worthy of the Hayes family name. And she'd embraced Cassandra like a long-lost sister, while completely ignoring the pregnant woman still standing in the kitchen. The 3 of them had laughed about something Victoria couldn't hear, their bodies forming a closed triangle that visually communicated her exclusion, yet she'd felt something shift inside her that morning, a fundamental change in how she understood power and patience. She'd spent 3 years trying to earn their acceptance, attempting to mold herself into whatever version of Victoria they might approve of, yet watching them celebrate her destruction had finally revealed the truth that some people's approval isn't worth pursuing because their judgment says more about them than it ever could about you. The divorce proceedings had moved with surprising speed, facilitated by Nathan's expensive attorneys and Victoria's deliberate choice not to contest any terms. She'd signed every document without argument, accepted the settlement that Nathan's lawyers considered generous, yet was actually laughable compared to her real net worth, and she'd moved out of the penthouse she technically owned within 72 hours of that birthday morning. Her new residence was a $15 million brownstone in the Upper East Side, purchased through the same offshore structures that protected her identity. Yet she'd deliberately chosen something understated because the final act of her marriage to Nathan Hayes required careful staging. Victoria had spent those 3 weeks between divorce and Nathan's wedding in meticulous preparation, reaching out to her network of attorneys and financial advisors who'd been managing her secret trillionaire status since before she'd ever met the man who'd just discarded her. Her lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in complex corporate ownership structures, had listened to Victoria's plan with growing appreciation before asking the question that mattered most. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once you reveal your identity, there's no going back to anonymity. Victoria had placed her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter's kick, and she'd thought about the legacy she wanted to leave for this child who would arrive in 3 months. She'd thought about the lies Nathan had told himself about being a self-made billionaire, conveniently forgetting the anonymous $12 million investment that had saved his company when banks had refused his loan applications and venture capitalists had stopped returning his calls. She'd remembered standing beside him when his assistant, had called about the mysterious transfer, watching his face light up with relief and excitement, yet he'd never once looked at her and considered that his pregnant wife might be capable of such resources. The anonymous donation had been intentional, a gift given out of love without expectation of credit or recognition, yet now that generosity felt like the greatest mistake of her life because it had allowed Nathan to construct a narrative of his own brilliance that had no foundation in reality. Patricia had assembled the evidence over those 3 weeks: bank transfer records, corporate ownership documents, emails between Victoria and her financial advisors that proved beyond doubt that she'd been the mysterious investor who'd saved Hayes Technology from bankruptcy. The paper trail was immaculate, every transaction documented and verified, yet the most damning evidence was the board meeting minutes from 18 months ago, where Nathan had presented the anonymous investment as proof of his business acumen and his ability to attract serious capital. Victoria had requested one additional piece of preparation, something that would announce her arrival with undeniable clarity before a single word was spoken. The midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom had been custom-ordered from the manufacturer in England, one of only 75 produced in that particular shade, with an interior featuring hand-stitched leather and wood trim from trees grown specifically for automotive luxury. The car had cost more than Nathan's annual salary, though Victoria owned it outright through one of her corporate entities, and she'd arranged for it to arrive at the plaza exactly 15 minutes after Nathan and Cassandra's vows were scheduled to conclude. The timing was deliberate, calculated to interrupt the reception at the moment when guests would be most relaxed and least expecting disruption, yet Victoria had spent considerable time ensuring that her arrival wouldn't feel like desperation or jealousy, but rather like the unveiling of truth that had been patiently waiting for its proper moment. She'd hired a former Secret Service agent named Marcus to serve as her driver and security, a man whose presence communicated protection and power without unnecessary aggression, and together they'd rehearsed her entrance until every movement conveyed the confidence of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The wedding day had arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed to mock Victoria's memories of rain-soaked vows 3 years ago, when she and Nathan had stood under umbrellas while guests had complained about ruined shoes and dampened spirits. The plaza had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, though Victoria supposed all lies looked beautiful when wrapped in enough flowers and crystal, and she'd watched the preparation from her hotel room, across the street through windows that offered a perfect view of the venue's grand entrance. Nathan had spared no expense for Cassandra, commissioning ice sculptures and importing orchids from Thailand, hiring a 20-piece orchestra, and a celebrity chef whose restaurants required 6-month advance reservations. Yet Victoria knew from her financial investigators that he'd taken a loan against his company's stock to finance this spectacle, because billionaires often confused leverage with actual wealth. She'd dressed with careful attention that morning, selecting an emerald Valentino gown that had been custom designed to celebrate rather than hide her 7-month pregnancy, the silk fabric cut to showcase her belly as a statement of pride instead of shame. The dress had cost $48,000, though Victoria owned shares in the fashion house that had designed it, and she'd paired it with diamonds that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who'd built her own pharmaceutical empire in the 1960s, when female executives were considered novelties rather than leaders. Marcus had arrived at precisely 2:15, his dark suit impeccable and his expression carefully neutral as he'd reviewed the security arrangements one final time. Victoria had appreciated his professionalism, the way he'd never asked questions about her motivations or expressed judgment about her plans. Yet she'd seen the slight smile that crossed his face when she'd explained the full scope of what she intended to reveal. The drive to the plaza had taken 11 minutes, though they'd circled the block twice to ensure their arrival coincided exactly with the planned timeline, and Victoria had used those minutes to review the documents Patricia had prepared. Ownership records showing Victoria's controlling interest in Hayes Technology, transfer receipts proving her $12 million investment, and email chains that demonstrated Nathan's knowledge had been deliberately limited to preserve his ego. The Rolls-Royce had glided through Manhattan traffic like a shark through shallow water, its presence commanding attention from pedestrians and drivers alike. Yet Victoria had barely noticed the external attention, because her focus remained fixed on the moment ahead and everything it represented about justice and truth. The vows had concluded at 2:47, according to the text message Victoria received from a friend who'd been invited to the wedding, someone who'd quietly supported Victoria through the divorce while maintaining social connections that allowed her to serve as inside observer. The reception had begun with champagne toasts and carefully choreographed first dances, with guests who represented the highest levels of New York society, tech entrepreneurs and hedge fund managers, politicians and media executives, people whose combined net worth could fund small nations, yet who'd gathered to celebrate a man who'd built his success on his ex-wife's secret investment. Victoria had waited until 3:02 before signaling Marcus to proceed, allowing enough time for guests to relax into the celebration, yet not so much time that attention would be scattered across multiple conversations. The Rolls-Royce had turned into the plaza's circular driveway, with its engine producing a sound that cost more than most luxury vehicles' entire value, a deep purr that announced arrival before visual confirmation, and Victoria had watched through tinted windows as heads began turning toward the unexpected interruption. Marcus had opened her door with practiced precision, his hand extended to assist her exit, though Victoria had needed minimal help despite her advanced pregnancy, and she'd emerged from the Rolls-Royce into afternoon sunlight that caught the diamonds at her throat and wrists with almost theatrical timing. The first gasp had come from someone near the entrance, followed by a ripple of recognition that spread through the crowd like electricity through water. Yet Victoria had kept her expression serene as she'd walked toward the reception, with documents tucked under her arm and confidence worn like armor. She'd recognized faces among the guests, business associates who'd attended dinner parties at the penthouse she'd secretly owned, social acquaintances who'd offered sympathy about her divorce, while simultaneously accepting invitations to Nathan's wedding, friends who'd proven themselves to be merely friendly when friendship required actual courage. Nathan had been standing near the wedding cake when Victoria entered, his arm around Cassandra's waist, yet his face had drained of color so completely that several guests had actually stepped forward thinking he might be having a medical emergency. Cassandra's reaction had been different, her expression cycling through confusion and anger before settling on something that resembled fear, though whether she feared social embarrassment or the loss of the lifestyle she'd believed she was marrying remained unclear to Victoria. The orchestra had faltered mid-song, violins trailing off into silence that felt almost sacred in its completeness. Yet Victoria had continued walking through the parted crowd with measured steps that suggested she had every right to be present and nothing to apologize for. She'd dressed for this moment, planned for this confrontation, yet nothing had quite prepared her for the surge of power that came from finally refusing to make herself smaller for people who'd never deserved her accommodation. Rebecca had spotted her then, her champagne flute freezing halfway to her lips as recognition transformed into rage, and Victoria had watched Nathan's sister begin pushing through the crowd with the kind of focused aggression that suggested violence was imminent. Patricia had warned her this might happen, had suggested additional security to prevent physical confrontation, yet Victoria had refused the extra protection because some moments required witnessing without interference. Rebecca had reached her in seconds that felt simultaneously infinite and instantaneous, her face twisted with hatred that seemed excessive even given their history of mutual dislike. Yet Victoria had stood her ground as Nathan's sister closed the distance between them. The words Rebecca screamed were lost in the rushing sound of Victoria's own heartbeat, accusations and insults that probably would have devastated her 3 months ago, but now felt like confirmation that she'd made the correct choice in ending her association with this family. What happened next occurred in slow motion, despite lasting less than 2 seconds. Rebecca's hand rising, her body coiling with intention, and then the spat landing on Victoria's cheek with enough force to snap her head slightly to the side. The crowd's collective gasp felt like wind rushing through a tunnel, and Victoria had stood perfectly still as saliva dripped down her face, her emerald gown marking her as target and victor simultaneously. 300 guests and at least 20 cameras had captured that moment. The instance when Nathan Hayes' sister had physically assaulted his pregnant ex-wife at his wedding reception, yet what they were about to witness would transform that assault from shocking to catastrophic. Victoria had reached into her purse with movements that seemed almost casual despite the saliva still glistening on her cheek, her hand emerging with a silk handkerchief that she used to wipe her face clean while maintaining eye contact with Rebecca, whose chest heaved with adrenaline and misplaced righteousness. The silence in the reception hall had become absolute, 300 people holding their collective breath as they waited to see how the pregnant woman in the emerald gown would respond to physical assault. Yet Victoria had simply smiled before reaching for the folder Patricia had prepared. The documents inside represented 18 months of careful financial management, anonymous generosity that had saved a failing company, and proof that the man celebrating his wedding had built his recent success on foundations he'd never acknowledged. Yet before Victoria could speak, Nathan had pushed through the crowd with Cassandra trailing behind him. His face had regained some color, though his eyes carried something Victoria had never seen before. Genuine fear mixed with dawning comprehension that perhaps his ex-wife wasn't the simple artist he'd believed he'd married. Nathan had demanded she leave immediately, his voice carrying the authority he used in boardrooms when addressing junior employees, yet Victoria had simply opened the folder and withdrawn the first document, a transfer receipt from Morrison Financial Group, showing $12 million wired to Hayes Technology on March 15th, 18 months ago. She'd held it up so the guests closest to her could see the official bank stamps and signatures, yet her voice when she finally spoke had been calm and measured as she'd addressed not Nathan but the crowd of witnesses who'd come to celebrate what they'd believed was a love story. Victoria had explained how Nathan's company had been 3 weeks from bankruptcy, how creditors had been threatening lawsuits and employees had been updating their resumes, and how an anonymous investor had appeared at precisely the moment Nathan needed rescue most. She'd watched his face cycle through emotions as memory clearly confirmed her words, yet what came next had transformed his expression from uncomfortable recognition to absolute devastation. The second document showed corporate ownership records for Hayes Technology, specifically the shareholder agreement that revealed Morrison Financial Group, Victoria's primary holding company, owned 62% of his company's stock, meaning she controlled his business with enough shares to outvote him on any major decision. The crowd had erupted in whispers that built into conversations that bordered on chaos, yet Victoria had continued speaking over the noise because truth deserved complete revelation rather than partial acknowledgement. She'd explained how she'd structured the investment through offshore accounts and shell corporations to protect Nathan's pride, how she'd wanted him to feel like the self-made billionaire he'd always aspired to be. Yet his response to her love and generosity had been to divorce her on her birthday and invite her to watch him marry his mistress. Patricia had warned her that public humiliation might feel satisfying in the moment, but hollow in memory. Yet standing there with her daughter kicking against her ribs and 300 witnesses watching Nathan's carefully constructed lies disintegrate, Victoria felt only the clean satisfaction of truth, finally spoken aloud. Cassandra had begun crying then, her mascara running in dark streaks that ruined the professional makeup application she'd spent 3 hours achieving that morning, and Victoria had almost felt sympathy for this woman who'd believed she was marrying wealth and security, but had actually married debt wrapped in designer suits. Rebecca had lunged forward again, her hands reaching for the documents as if destroying evidence could somehow erase reality, Yet Marcus had stepped between them with presence that suggested interference would be inadvisable. Nathan's sister had screamed about lawyers and lawsuits, about defamation and lies, yet her protests had sounded hollow against the documented proof Victoria held in her hands. The third document Victoria revealed had been the most personally devastating: email chains between Nathan and his CFO discussing the miracle investor who'd saved their company, with Nathan specifically instructing his team never to investigate the donor's identity because some gifts shouldn't be questioned. That instruction had been Nathan's choice, his decision to remain deliberately ignorant so he could claim credit for a turnaround he hadn't engineered. Yet now that choice had transformed from convenient fiction into public exposure of his dishonesty. Victoria had watched several of Nathan's business partners pull out their phones, clearly already calculating how this revelation would affect their own investments and partnerships with Hayes Technology. Yet she'd felt no triumph in their abandonment because revenge had never been her motivation. Vindication was what she'd sought, and vindication was what she'd achieved. The wedding reception had collapsed into chaos within minutes of Victoria's revelations, with guests departing in clusters while whispering about the scandal they'd witnessed. Yet Victoria had remained standing in the center of the hall, like the eye of a hurricane. Nathan had approached her finally, his voice barely above a whisper as he'd asked why she'd never told him about her wealth. Yet Victoria had recognized the question as fundamentally flawed because it assumed her money was the relevant detail rather than his character. She'd explained that she'd wanted to be loved for herself rather than her net worth, that she'd hoped building a partnership based on emotional connection rather than financial transaction would create something authentic. Yet his response to that vulnerability had been to discard her the moment someone more convenient appeared. Cassandra had left then, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she'd rushed toward the exit, and Victoria had wondered if Nathan understood yet that his new wife had married potential rather than reality and would likely file her own divorce papers before their first anniversary. Rebecca had been escorted from the venue by Plaza security after attempting to physically attack Victoria a third time, her screams about gold-digging whores echoing through marble halls in delicious irony, given that Victoria's net worth exceeded the Hayes family fortune by a factor of 17. Nathan's business partners had requested emergency meetings before even leaving the reception, their faces carrying the kind of serious concern that suggested Nathan's position as CEO of his own company might not survive the week. Yet Victoria had felt no satisfaction in his professional destruction because she'd genuinely loved him once, and the death of love always deserves mourning regardless of how it ends. She'd left the plaza as the sun began setting, Marcus holding the Rolls-Royce door as she'd settled into leather seats that cost more than most people's annual salary. Yet the real luxury had been the freedom of finally living without pretense or apology. Her daughter had kicked strongly as they'd driven through Manhattan, and Victoria had placed her hand on her belly while imagining the conversations they'd have someday about dignity and self-worth, about the difference between revenge and justice, and about how the greatest power comes not from wealth itself, but from refusing to let others define your value based on their limited perception. The story had broken on social media within an hour, video footage of Rebecca's assault and Victoria's revelation spreading across platforms with the kind of viral momentum that destroys reputations permanently. Yet Victoria had turned off her phone and spent the evening in her brownstone nursery painting flowers on walls that would welcome her daughter in 3 months. Nathan's company stock had dropped 23% in after-hours trading. His board of directors had called emergency sessions to discuss leadership changes, and Cassandra had been photographed leaving the plaza alone while still wearing her wedding dress. Yet none of these consequences had been Victoria's doing. They were simply the natural results of lies meeting truth and cruelty meeting justice. She'd received a text from Patricia later that night, a simple message that read, "The Hayes family attorneys have requested a meeting to discuss stock buyback options." And Victoria had smiled because even in destruction, Nathan was trying to regain control of a narrative that had never been his to write. She'd declined the meeting request and instead sent instructions to her financial team to maintain her controlling interest in Hayes Technology while removing Nathan from all operational authority, not out of vengeance but because her daughter deserved to inherit a company built on truth rather than fiction. The midnight blue Rolls-Royce sat in her private garage that night, its presence a reminder that some arrivals change everything, while others simply reveal what was always true. And Victoria had stood in her daughter's nursery, thinking about the lessons she'd learned from loving someone who'd never deserved her generosity. She'd learned that silence can be strategic rather than weak, that patience transforms pain into power, and that the greatest gift you can give yourself is refusing to shrink for people who were always going to underestimate you, regardless of how small you made yourself. The birthday cake from 3 months ago had been thrown away that same morning. 30 candles melted into useless wax, yet somehow, Victoria felt more celebration standing in her truth than she'd ever felt trying to earn approval from people who'd never intended to grant it. Her daughter kicked again, strong and insistent, and Victoria had whispered promises about the world they'd build together, a world where women didn't have to hide their power to make men comfortable, where love meant elevation rather than diminishment, and where the greatest revenge was simply living well and refusing to let anyone else's cruelty define your worth. 3 years had passed since the plaza wedding that never was, yet Victoria still remembered the weight of those documents in her hands and the expression on Nathan's face when his carefully constructed world had collapsed in front of 300 witnesses. Her daughter Isabella was 2.5 now, a whirlwind of curiosity and laughter, who'd inherited her mother's determination and, fortunately, none of her father's capacity for casual cruelty, though Nathan had never requested visitation rights after Victoria's revelations had destroyed both his marriage and his reputation. The brownstone had been transformed over those years into something that felt like home rather than refuge, with Isabella's artwork covering the refrigerator and toys scattered across floors that Victoria no longer felt compelled to keep immaculate because perfection was exhausting when measured against someone else's standards. Hayes Technology had been restructured under Victoria's ownership, renamed Morrison Tech Solutions, and was now valued at 3 times its worth from the day she'd walked into that wedding reception, though the success felt less satisfying than she'd anticipated because revenge had never been about money. It had always been about dignity. Nathan had moved to California 6 months after the wedding disaster, taking a position at a startup that had subsequently failed within 18 months. Yet Victoria had heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd finally found employment at a mid-level tech firm where his billionaire persona had been replaced by the reality of being a competent yet unremarkable executive. Cassandra had divorced him before their first anniversary, as Victoria had predicted, the annulment citing fraud and misrepresentation, though the irony of Cassandra claiming to be deceived about Nathan's financial status had not been lost on anyone who'd witnessed the plaza catastrophe. Rebecca had retreated from public life entirely. After multiple videos of her assault on a pregnant woman had gone viral, her social standing destroyed by her own actions captured from 17 different camera angles. Yet Victoria had felt no satisfaction in her exile because hatred was exhausting to maintain, and she'd discovered that indifference was far more peaceful than sustained anger. The Hayes family had attempted to purchase Victoria's controlling shares in what was now Morrison Tech Solutions multiple times over 3 years, each offer more desperate than the last. Yet she'd declined every proposal because the company represented more than financial investment. It represented the truth about who'd really built the success Nathan had claimed as his own achievement. Isabella had started asking questions recently about her father, simple inquiries that children make when they notice their family structure differs from their friends' households. Yet Victoria had answered honestly without bitterness because her daughter deserved truth delivered with love rather than anger. She'd explained that some people aren't capable of being good parents, even when given the opportunity, that choosing to love yourself and your child is sometimes more important than maintaining relationships that drain rather than nourish. Though she'd promised Isabella that when she was older, they'd discuss the full story in ways appropriate for her understanding. Nathan had sent a birthday card on Isabella's second birthday, the first communication he'd initiated since the Plaza wedding, yet the generic message inside suggested he'd purchased it from a drugstore rack without reading the pre-printed sentiment that referenced watching you grow when he'd deliberately chosen absence. Victoria had saved the card in a box she kept in her closet, alongside the divorce papers and wedding invitation, artifacts from a life that felt increasingly distant, yet had taught her essential lessons about self-worth and the danger of loving people who viewed you as accessory rather than equal. The business world had slowly adjusted to understanding that Victoria Morrison, she'd reclaimed her family name after the divorce, was not Nathan's former wife, but rather a trillionaire investor whose portfolio included tech companies, real estate holdings, and pharmaceutical investments that generated wealth. Her ex-husband couldn't imagine. She'd been featured in Forbes and Fortune, interviewed about her investment strategy and her approach to anonymous philanthropy, yet she'd declined requests to discuss Nathan or the Plaza wedding because some stories deserved to remain private even when they'd been lived publicly. Patricia remained her primary attorney, though they'd become genuine friends over 3 years of working together, and Patricia's firm now handled all legal matters for Morrison Tech Solutions, along with Victoria's expanding portfolio of investments in women-owned businesses. Marcus still served as her driver and head of security, his professional demeanor unchanged, yet his relationship with Isabella had evolved into something resembling uncle and niece. With weekend trips to the park and patient answers to endless questions about why the Rolls-Royce had so many buttons, Victoria had started a foundation 18 months ago focused on supporting women leaving difficult marriages, providing financial resources and legal assistance to those who lacked the secret trillionaire status that had protected her own exit. The foundation operated quietly without public fanfare, yet the hundreds of women it had helped represented the kind of legacy Victoria wanted to build. One based on elevation rather than destruction, on support rather than revenge. She'd received a letter from one recipient last month, a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage with her 3 children and had used foundation resources to start a business that now employed 17 people. And Victoria had cried reading about this stranger's success because it represented everything she believed about the transformative power of strategic generosity. Isabella had found her crying and had patted her face with pudgy toddler hands, asking why Mama was sad. Yet Victoria had explained these were happy tears because sometimes joy and gratitude feel overwhelming enough to manifest as crying. The Plaza had invited Victoria to several charity events over the 3 years since the wedding disaster, their marketing team apparently believing that her presence would generate publicity, yet she'd declined each invitation because returning to that venue held no appeal when she'd already claimed her victory and moved forward. She'd sold the penthouse she'd secretly owned during her marriage to Nathan, the one he'd believed he'd purchased with his billionaire success, and the new owners had no idea about the history contained within those walls or the tears that had been shed in the bedroom where she'd planned a future that had evaporated like morning fog. The money from that sale had been donated entirely to domestic violence shelters, anonymous contributions that arrived without explanation or expectation of recognition, yet Victoria had learned that the best gifts were those given without audience because true generosity required no witnesses beyond your own conscience. Nathan's sister Rebecca had attempted to reach out twice through intermediaries, messages claiming she wanted to apologize and rebuild their relationship. Yet Victoria had politely declined both overtures because forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, and she'd discovered that some people deserved to remain in your past rather than your present. She'd heard that Rebecca had started therapy and was working on anger management, information delivered by the same mutual friend who'd texted her during the plaza wedding. Yet Victoria felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy, because Rebecca's journey toward becoming a better person was separate from Victoria's obligation to provide access or absolution. Isabella would never know her Aunt Rebecca, would grow up without the Hayes family influence, yet Victoria believed this absence was protection rather than deprivation, because toxic relationships damaged children regardless of blood connection. The midnight blue Rolls-Royce remained in Victoria's garage, driven occasionally for special occasions, yet mostly serving as reminder of the day she'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Isabella loved sitting in the driver's seat, making engine noises while Marcus patiently pretended they were driving to important destinations, and Victoria would watch these interactions, thinking about how her daughter would grow up, understanding that power came from authenticity rather than performance. She'd started writing down the story of those 3 years with Nathan, not for publication but for Isabella to read someday when she was old enough to understand complex truths about love and betrayal, dignity and revenge, silence and strategic revelation. The document lived on her laptop, password protected and constantly evolving, yet writing it had provided unexpected healing because narrating your own story rather than letting others define it represented a fundamental reclaiming of authority over your life's meaning. Victoria had dated sporadically over the 3 years, careful introductions arranged by friends who insisted she deserved companionship. Yet none of the relationships had progressed beyond casual dinners because she'd discovered that solitude felt safer than vulnerability after Nathan's betrayal. Patricia had warned her that fear of future hurt was understandable, yet shouldn't become permanent barrier to connection, and Victoria knew this was true even as she struggled to imagine trusting someone with the kind of complete openness that real partnership required. She'd explained to one particularly persistent suitor that her capacity for romantic love had been damaged in ways that required more healing time than 3 years could provide. Yet she'd promised herself that eventually she'd risk opening her heart again, because living in permanent defense meant Nathan had claimed more victory than he deserved. Isabella deserved to see her mother in healthy relationship, to understand that love could exist without cruelty and partnership could thrive without dominance. Yet Victoria also believed that teaching her daughter about self-sufficiency and independence was equally valuable lesson about what women could achieve without romantic partnership defining their worth. The story of the plaza wedding had faded from social media eventually, replaced by newer scandals and fresh outrages, yet occasionally Victoria would encounter people who recognized her from the viral videos, and their reactions revealed more about them than about her. Some expressed admiration for her restraint and strategic revelation, while others suggested she'd been cruel to publicly humiliate Nathan, regardless of his betrayal. Yet Victoria had learned that people's judgments about your choices often reflected their own fears about what they'd do in similar circumstances. She'd stopped explaining or defending her decisions years ago, recognizing that those who understood required no explanation, while those who didn't understand wouldn't accept any explanation she could provide. Yet she slept peacefully, knowing she'd acted with integrity, even when facing people who'd shown her none. Morrison Tech Solutions had announced revolutionary developments in artificial intelligence last month. Innovations that would transform the industry. Nathan had once believed he dominated, yet his name appeared nowhere in the press releases or patent applications because history belonged to those who actually did the work, rather than those who claimed credit for others' achievements. Victoria had hired the employees Nathan had laid off during his cost-cutting phase, the talented engineers and designers he'd dismissed while paying himself bonuses, and their gratitude had translated into loyalty that produced the kind of innovation that came from feeling valued rather than exploited. The company culture she'd built emphasized collaboration over competition, equity over hierarchy, and work-life balance over performative overwork, yet productivity had increased 47% since she'd assumed control because people produced their best work when treated with dignity and respect. Isabella had fallen asleep in Victoria's arms as evening settled over Manhattan, her small body warm and trusting in ways that reminded Victoria why she'd fought so hard for dignity and truth 3 years ago at the plaza. She'd protected her daughter from knowing the full story of her conception and her father's rejection, yet someday Isabella would read the documents Victoria had saved and understand that her mother's love had been powerful enough to stand alone when partnership had proven impossible. The birthday cake from 3 years ago had been replaced by hundreds of celebrations since: Isabella's birthdays and holidays, quiet victories and small joys. Yet Victoria still remembered those 30 candles melting into wax, and the moment she'd realized that being discarded by someone who'd never valued you wasn't tragedy, but rather liberation disguised as loss. The epilogue of Victoria's story wasn't about Nathan's destruction or Rebecca's exile or even the success of Morrison Tech Solutions, though all those elements had played their part in her journey. The real epilogue was about a woman who'd discovered that her worth wasn't determined by who loved her, but rather by how she loved herself. That power came from living authentically rather than performing for approval, and that the greatest victory was simply building a life so fulfilling that revenge became irrelevant because you were too busy creating joy to dwell on past pain. Isabella stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about butterflies